remind people that next week Jim Young will be giving us a talk about critical thinking. On Saturday, but on the 11th, there is a meeting with Andrew Seidel from the Freedom from Religion Foundation, to which everyone is invited. It's on the meetup. On the 19th, we will have David Van Ness, I can never say his name right, sorry, who will be talking with us about evolution and new findings in the human evolution. And then on the 26th, we'll be having a guest from the named Adam East. I can never remember his name, sorry. Who is a writer with Patheos, who writes, he wrote a book called Daylight Atheism, and he will be here talking with us about the need for racial diversity in the atheist community. So we will have quite a number of interesting topics this month to share, and we will be, I'm in touch with a number of other speakers, but if anyone has someone they would like to hear or a topic they would like to hear about, please feel free to let me know so we can make those arrangements. By the way, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Judy Atkins, and I'm the chairperson of Atheists of Florida, which is basically the sponsor of this meeting. And I welcome everyone here. I think this will be quite an interesting topic, and he's quite a fascinating man. We do ask that you mute unless you're going to ask a question, and then we, so that doesn't, if it doesn't get too chaotic, we can just go ahead and let people interrupt, but if it gets too chaotic, we will ask you to raise the electronic hand, which I can never remember where it is because my screen is different than everybody else's.
It's under participants.
Under participants, so just click on participants thing on the bottom of the screen, and you should see have the ability to raise your hand. And I see Rick O'Keefe is already asking a question. Mr. O'Keefe, you have a question, or you're just showing people how to do it? Uh-oh, is he not able to talk again? Let me put my chat window up.
Judy?
Yes?
I have closed captioning. I have closed captioning.
Wonderful. Great.
Yeah.
I've been trying to work on that, but I didn't think it was going to work out. And Rick, no, we can't hear you.
Kind of delayed.
Yeah, I would expect it to be because it's real time translating, so to speak.
It sometimes doesn't get it quite right.
Oh, Rick has no mic again, so I guess he was just letting us know that he will not. You can certainly welcome to ask questions in the chat room, and I will try to monitor that and make sure your questions get asked if you don't want to talk up in the room.
I don't have a raise my hand button.
Yeah. Okay, I don't know why not.
I'm pretty sure you must have one. It's just a matter of finding it.
Yeah.
Well, the only thing I have under participants is invite.
Do you have a more option?
Yeah,
A what option?
More option, M-O-R-E, with the dots?
Yeah.
Try that.
No.
Yes, that's the one.
That's the one?
A more?
Yes.
Yeah,
More.
down at the bottom of the screen where it says mute and
at the bottom of the chat screen, that is.
At the bottom of the chat screen, sorry.
It's the fifth one from the left, or the second one from the right. And you'll see there's a thumbs up and a thumbs down. And there's a number of options.
I'll just use the chat because I can't find it. So.
All right.
And I don't see more.
You don't see more.
Are you on a computer?
I'm on an Apple computer, yes.
Oh, that may be I don't know how Apple's set up, sorry.
Okay. Doesn't matter. I'll just use the chat if I
Okay.
need.
Or you
All
can
right.
just wave and we'll.
I'll
Yeah, we can-
wave. Yeah. Hello, teacher.
Or just wait for a pause in the
That's the way to
action
go.
and say hello.
All right, Joe, are you about ready?
I'm ready, waiting on you.
I'm sorry we weren't
Okay.
able to get the trumpeters today, but
Yes.
we'll make do. We'll try.
All right,
I
you
have a
have the
trumpet.
floor. You have the floor, Mr. Reinhardt.
Thank you, Judy. Joe Reinhardt here. Today we're going to talk about the magnificent agnostic, Robert Ingersoll, whom many have called the most famous person that no one ever heard about. There's a good reason for that, and I'll just touch on that briefly to start, and that is that for years, and even on to this very day, the churches in this country have made a concerted effort to remove from public libraries and other places where they might be seen or read any books that had to do with free thought or blasphemy or atheism, books by Thomas Paine or Robert Ingersoll or Voltaire, just to name a few. So for that reason, even today, libraries have a very scant supply of free thought literature. And that's why, in spite of the fact that more people heard Robert Ingersoll speak than any man who ever lived prior to the invention of radio, there are very, very few people, even freethinkers, atheists, and agnostics, as he called himself, who have even heard of him or are familiar with his works, of which there are available in a nicely bound 12-volume set that was published in 1903. It's called the Dresden edition. The Atheists of Florida has a 12-volume set available in their library. So anyone wishing to read anything by Robert Ingersoll, then that they can curl up with next to the fireplace, can come down and get as many volumes as they like for a reasonable period of time. Failing that, everything he ever wrote is available online. The Gutenberg Press is a good place to look. And in addition to that, you can buy a compact disc. Maybe it's a DVD. Either way, it's only about $5. It also has his collected works, which is still far less than the $200 to $500 you'd expect to pay for the 12-volume set on eBay at this moment. So, so much for what's available in terms of what Ingersoll had to say, and he had a lot to say. Once he died, fewer and fewer people even became aware of some of the finest writings on the subject ever done. I like to be able, when I'm discoursing or discussing religion with believers, I like to be able to beat them to death with their own Bible. Ingersoll is perfectly suited for that because he could stand up and lecture on the Bible or debate on the Bible for hours without even having a Bible at hand or notes of any sort. The man was a phenomenal speaker, obviously. He was born in 1833 in Dresden, New York, a town of about 300 people. There's a museum there today in his birthplace. You can visit it. I unfortunately have never been in Dresden, New York. If I had been, that's the first place I would have gone. I don't know if they have a bar. In any case, he died in 1899. Died rather suddenly. He just apparently coughed and made a bit of a sound and died almost instantly. So he went without suffering, and you always have to envy that. All right, so his early life was pretty much shaped by the fact that his father was an itinerant preacher, a real fire and brimstone sort who would take over a congregation, and once he told them how unpleasant their futures were all going to be, we often found that he wasn't very welcome there, and so his average pulpacy, if you want to call it that, and I do, was about 2 years. So Ingersoll moved quite frequently, and since his father, again, was a fundamentalist of the most fundamental sort, he learned the Bible at an early age, could recite it almost word for word, and therefore, of course, he was a total expert on it. He then, he and his younger brother became attorneys, and they practiced, for about 25 years as a partnership. He did quite well. He was one of the lead attorneys on the Star Route trials. There were 6 of those before they finally ended in a mistrial. That accounted for his early recognition, and also for the fact that he became fairly well-to-do. Married his childhood, well, not childhood sweetheart, but a lady, Eva, who actually was a free thinker, somewhat like himself, very unusual for the time. And they were quite happily married, had 2 daughters. He, instead of making them beg for money, would just had a bowl of cash, and when they needed some, they'd go get it out of the bowl. Quite different from most of the men in his day and age. So then along came the Civil War. Ingersoll helped to form a northern brigade or group of soldiers of some size, and was a colonel during the Civil War. He was captured by the Confederacy. He spent about a year or so as a prisoner, and was released before the end of the war. Curiously enough, his Confederate captors spoke very highly of him, said that he was an interesting and honest and sincere man, had a great sense of humor. They were almost sorry to release him, not because of the war, but because they enjoyed his company. So, so much for Colonel Robert Ingersoll. Now, I have, and let me reverse this thing if I can get it to work. I have here an advertisement. I think that'll work, although it looks like it might be reversed. It's why millions flocked to hear him. It's an advertisement for the 12-volume set that I spoke about a minute ago.
It showed up okay, Joe. Just so you know.
It does show up okay.
Yeah.
When I see it, it's reversed.
Yeah.
Of course, that would make sense. Nevertheless, you could buy the set for 12 monthly payments of $3 a piece, plus $1 the first month, or you got a 10% discount if you send it in cash on the barrelheads. But it's an interesting ad. Send no money. For 50 years, Colonel Robert G. Ingersoll spoke before packed houses wherever he appeared. He drew greater crowds than any other one man of his time. He was implored by governors, senators, and presidents to speak for their cause. So it goes on, but it's an interesting and timely piece. Again, it was published in 1903, an advertisement for his book. And he also gained a good deal of fame as a politician. He was a Republican. He delivered what was called the Plumed Knight speech, in which he nominated James Blaine, the senator from Maine, for the Republican candidate for president. A lot of us are familiar with the Blaine Amendment, of which some 2/3 or more of the states still have in their constitutions, which forbids the transfer of any public funds to any religious institutions by anyone for any purpose. And as we all know, the Blaine Amendment is under attack, ferocious attack, and suffered a big setback when the Supreme Court ruled just this week that it was perfectly okay to subsidize religious schools as long as you subsidized public schools. Many of you have seen what a chink that put in the wall of separation. I want to invite anybody who has any comments or questions. Don't hesitate to wave your hand or ask for the electronic hand wave. I'd be more than happy to share the floor with anybody. And I certainly don't want to sit here and just drone on for the better part of an hour, although talking about Ingersoll is, I hope, interesting. So I'd like to, in fact, give you a couple of excerpts of some of the examples of things that Ingersoll wrote. I'll try not to read the entire piece. I don't want to again, use up all my time with that. But I would also like to recommend what I consider is 2 flagship works, and they're both very short, and they're both contained in the 12-volume set, or you can buy them even as separate pamphlets. The first of which is Some Mistakes of Moses, in which he discusses the Pentateuch, how it was written, who wrote it, and the contradictions and barbarity and the insanities of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And there's also a great rebuttal, Some Mistakes of Ingersoll, some minister who doesn't bear mention, wrote, that's kind of funny, at least the first pages. The second of his works that I would like to recommend is About the Holy Bible. Again, as I said before, it's really nice to be able to discuss the Holy Bible with believers, and it's also pretty frequent that if you study the Bible at all in any way, you already know a good deal more about the Bible than the average person claims to be a believer in it. They're a lot like Trump supporters who all say, read the transcripts, and until you ask them, well, have you read the transcript? And they all say, well, no, I haven't. Same thing with the Bible believers. Most of them have no idea of the barbarities and the human sacrifice and the treatment of women and on that occurs. Or a good example of Ingersoll's wit is the phrase where he says, he's describing hell, and he says, for those whom God, in his infinite mercy, is about to condemn for all eternity. In one sentence, that says more about the idiocy of the Bible than I could probably do in the whole hour that I have, the time that I have remaining in any case. So anyway, that's a good example of Ingersoll's wit and wisdom in one sentence. Some other examples here of Ingersoll quotes. Again, feel free to interject at any time. I don't know if there's anyone out there who considers themselves an Ingersoll fan, who has maybe read some Ingersoll. Anybody, any comments on that? No? All right, Ingersoll. To hate men and worship God seems to be the sum of all the creeds. Another quote. The notion that faith in Christ is to be rewarded by an eternity of bliss, while a dependence upon reason, observation, and experience merits everlasting pain, is too absurd for refutation, and can only be believed by that unhappy mixture of insanity and ignorance called faith. Ingersoll wasn't one to mince words too much. Christianity has such a contemptible opinion of human nature that it does not believe a man can tell the truth unless frightened by a belief in God. No lower opinion of the human race has ever been expressed. And it may be that ministers really think that their prayers do good, and it may be that frogs imagine that their croaking brings the spring. So, I have another short read that again discusses the breadth of the topics that Ingersoll liked to discuss. And he visited the tomb of Napoleon and had some reflections on what it felt like to stand over the grave of a person who was responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of people, whom, in fact, the average Frenchman is, as I've read, almost an inch or so shorter than most other countries as a consequence of the Napoleonic Wars, because it obviously decimated a stronger and healthier Frenchmen, because so many of them were killed. And he says, a little while ago, I stood by the grave of Napoleon, a magnificent tomb of gilt and gold, fit almost for a dead deity. I saw him walking upon the banks of the Seine, contemplating suicide. I saw him putting down the mob in the streets of Paris. I saw him at the head of the army in Italy and Egypt, in France with the Eagles. I saw him at Marengo, at Ulm, at Austerlitz, and Russia. I saw him at Leipzig in defeat and disaster, in Paris, in Elba. I saw him escape and retake an empire by the force of his genius. And I saw him at the frightful field of Waterloo. And again in St. Helena, with his hands crossed behind him, gazing out at the sea. And I said, I would rather have been a French peasant and worn wooden shoes. I would rather have lived in a hut with a vine on the door. And I would rather have been poor with my peasant but loving wife by my side, knitting as the day died. I would rather have been that man and gone down to the tongueless silence of the dreamless dust than to have been that imperial impersonation of force and murder known as Napoleon Bonaparte. And so I would 10,000 times more rather be a peasant. So now, I mentioned ago what I consider to be his flagship work about the Holy Bible, and I've also mentioned his wit to some extent. So I'd like to read what he had to say as his opening for his treatise on the Holy Bible, which is, somebody ought to tell the truth about the Bible. The preachers dare not, because they would be driven from their pulpits. Professors in colleges dare not, because they would lose their salaries. Politicians dare not, they would be defeated. And editors dare not, they would lose subscribers. Merchants dare not, because they might lose customers. And men of fashion dare not, fearing that they would lose caste. Even clerks dare not, because they might be discharged. And so I thought I would do it myself. Ah, yes, the Ten Commandments. This is, again, particularly interesting because it's a very heated debate going on today about whether or not our country is founded on Christian principles and whether or not the Ten Commandments are the basis for our laws. And in fact, as we all know, they want to put copies of the Ten Commandments in every school or every schoolroom in every state in the country if they had the opportunity to do that. Here's what Robert Ingersoll has to say about the Ten Commandments. Some Christian lawyers, some eminent and stupid judges, have said and still say that the Ten Commandments are the foundation of all law. Nothing could be more absurd. Long before these commandments were given, there were codes of laws in India and Egypt, laws against murder, perjury, larceny, adultery, and fraud. Such laws are as old as human society, as old as the love of life, as old as industry, as the idea of prosperity, as old as human love. All of the Ten Commandments that were good were old. All that were new are foolish. If Jehovah had been civilized, he would have left out the commandment about keeping the Sabbath and say in its place would have said, "Thou shalt not enslave thy fellow men." He would have omitted the one about swearing and said, "The man shall have but one wife, and the woman but one husband." He would have left out the one about graven image and instead would have said, "Thou shalt not wage wars of extermination, and thou shalt not unsheath the sword except in self-defense." If Jehovah had been civilized, how much grander the Ten Commandments would have been. Jehovah is a little bit, uncivilized. All that we call progress, the enfranchisement of men, of labor, the substitution of imprisonment for death, a fine for imprisonment, the destruction of polygamy, the establishing of free speech, of the rights of conscience. In short, all that has tended to the development and civilization of man, all the results of investigation, observation, experience, and free thought, all that man has accomplished for the benefit of man since the close of the Dark Ages has been done in spite of the Old Testament.
I have a question. He forgot to leave out the one about boiling the lamb with a goat. I can't remember which one is in its mother's milk. What does that have to do with our law system?
Oh, well, that is the third version of the Ten Commandments. You know, Ingersoll doesn't go into this as much as Joseph Smith, who wrote a long piece about the Ten Commandments. The first Ten Commandment, and I think this is worth covering. The first 10 Commandments, Moses broke those when he came down from the hill, which of course, if he did that, is the greatest crime against humanity ever in history. The second set, or the first set was given orally, excuse me. The second set Moses brought down, and the third set, God said, well, come on back up and bring some tablets and I'll write them again for you. And when he got up there, he told Moses, here, you write them, and he told him what they were. And the third set, the one that supposedly survived and was carried around along with the Ark of the Covenant, the last one was, thou shalt not seethe a kid in its mother's milk, which is to say, you can't boil a baby sheep in its mother's milk. And even that's called, well, we call it voodoo, actually. It's called sympathetic magic. And even today, there are people that won't sell you milk if you're going to heat it because superstition says that it causes the mother's milk to become sour, for the mother to run dry. And for the same reason that you don't want to boil a mother's child in its own milk, because it would affect the mother or the other sheep or goats or herd, the other members of the herd. And therefore they would all suffer as a consequence of it. We don't ever hear that particular version preached, and we don't ever hear anybody lobbying to put that up in the lobby at the school either. Sympathetic magic.
Andrea has a question.
For a long time. Yeah, go ahead.
Me? Is me?
Yes.
Yeah, what you were talking about, boiling a child in mother's milk, that's where the kosher laws come in, and why you can't eat milk and meat together.
You can't even have two different kinds of food on the same plate.
Yeah, I guess.
Now,
Some people even have separate refrigerators and two sets of dishes, one for milk and one for meat.
Right. You know, the Ten Commandments are really only a part of the laws of the Old Testament, of which there are something like several hundred of them. I think 600 is the number that comes to mind. And from those, they cull the Ten Commandments, but there are all kinds of absurd things that you're not allowed to do. You know, like a woman who is menstruating has to be separated from the rest of the clan or the tribe. And if she has a son, she has to be quarantined for a month. But if it's a daughter, it's 2 months, and on, just silly stuff like that. And again, the idea that you can't have two different kinds of food on the same plate, and you can't make a garment with two different types of fabric either.
Even today, the Orthodox Jews, the women have to go into what's called a mikveh, which is a tub of water, basically. It's a special tub of water to cleanse her after her period.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure that works. There is a prescription in the Old Testament whereby a woman who has been accused of infidelity is compelled to drink a water concoction that's mixed with dirt off the floor of the synagogue, among other things. And if that causes her to have an abortion or to abort, then it's clear that the child is not the child of her husband, whereas if she doesn't abort, then she's faithful. But so much for the argument that God's against abortion. He has instructions on how to give them. Thank you, Andrea. I want to give you another example here of, on a lighter note, of the wit of Robert Ingersoll. A Mrs. Van Cott, who was a woman, obviously, a revivalist, and he's being interviewed by some newspaper, doesn't matter. And the question is, it says, I see, Colonel, that in an interview published this morning, Mrs. Van Cott, the revivalist, calls you a poor barking dog. Do you know her personally? Answer, I have never met or seen her, but I have written a response. My dear madam, were you constrained by the love of Christ to call a man who has never injured you a poor barking dog? Did you make this remark as a Christian or as a lady?
Joe, we have another question.
All right, let me finish this quote and we'll take the question. It's only one more, two more sentences. I say these words to, did you say these words to illustrate in some faint degree the refining influence upon women of the religion you preach? What would you think of me if I should retort, using your language, changing only the sex of the last word? I have the honor to remain yours truly, Robert Ingersoll. Question? Comment?
Yes. Hi.
Go.
I would like to know, because I couldn't find it when I looked him up this morning and read about it, a real good explanation. Why did he turn away? I mean, he and his brother were raised by this father who was religious and was a pastor and preached in his own type of way. But I couldn't really, and he studied law and I saw all that, but I couldn't really see what it was that turned him away from the church or the Bible or religion, because if I look at maybe personal experience, for example, of having been brought up religious, but then discovering during my life the hypocrisy of organized religion has been that which has led me away from it. So I was looking to try to see what was it that led Ingersoll away from this basis, which was unusual for the time.
Well, I don't recall ever reading any specific event like the death of his mother or some tragedy or some event that he witnessed where he had a 180-degree turnaround on his views. I think the impression I get is that his father's unpopularity caused him to raise questions about the accuracy of what he had to say, when even churches would say, well, listen, go somewhere else because we don't like what you have to say. Secondly, Ingersoll cared less about the idiocies and the contradictions of the Bible as much as he cared about the barbarity of the Bible. And most of all, he cared about the catalyst for almost all persecution, and that is the idea of hell and an eternal life. The idea of eternal punishment for finite crime was anathema to Ingersoll, and he once said that one of the greatest achievements of his life was that while he couldn't convince his father that Christianity was bogus, he was at least able to persuade him that the idea of an eternal punishment was probably not accurate, and that not everyone would be suffering forever. And he talks about, there's only one reason to punish people, and that is to correct them so that their behavior will improve. And if you punish them forever without any recourse, then what's the purpose of punishment unless you're just a fiend? In fact, he at that point says the idea of eternal punishment in hell makes of God a fiendish monster. So I think it was his repugnance that he felt from the evils of the Old Testament and the persecutions, the inquisitions that started. And he says, Christ had to know that all of this persecution would occur in his name. All he had to do was say, don't persecute people in my name. And millions of people like Giordano Bruno and Servetes and on and on and on wouldn't have found their way to the stake. The amount of suffering and the amount of people who were failed to be flayed alive, had Christ but said one word about don't do this, would have stopped all that. And Ingersoll, again, questions the authority of the Bible based on the fact that no one of infinite mercy would ever let things like that occur.
Okay.
So
That's the reason
if
he
we wanna
embraced the law then, in your opinion? Is that why he became a lawyer and embraced the law?
No, in my opinion, it's the reverse. I've often said that I cannot understand how anybody could be a lawyer and believe in a God, because if they don't teach you about false analogies and circular reasoning and argument by assertion in law school, you're not much of a lawyer. And the ability to discern a bogus argument is one of the foundations, so I understand, of a good attorney. And I think that learning is exactly the antidote to religion. Ingersoll thought in the 19th century that religion was headed out the door, would be off the planet pretty much within the next few decades, for the simple reason that the Industrial Revolution brought about a general increase in the people's ability to learn, to go to school, to break away from the farm and the small town and the small ideas, and that it gave them the economic wherewithal to think independently. We know that his time frame was way off, but we also see it happening today. The religious ranks are shrinking as knowledge increases. The God of the gaps is getting smaller all the time. So Ingersoll was right. He was just wrong by a century or so. And religion will always be with us. There'll always be believers, just like there'll always be Trump supporters.
Do you think that's why
Not
there's,
my fault. It's not my fault.
yeah. Do you think that's why there's so much opposition to public education and the move to get all the
Yes.
funds misdirected to religious schools?
Of course, I want to indoctrinate my children. Again, quoting Ingersoll, the Catholics will teach you just enough to be a Catholic, and the Protestants just enough to be a Protestant. That's what their schools are for, and that's why they want private schools, so they can do that, so they don't have to go to public schools where they can learn about things like Robert Ingersoll. Yes.
Jim, did you want to say you made a comment in the chat room?
Yes.
Did you want to talk about that?
Well, I was observing, according to the narrative that Joe just provided, that it seems to me highly likely that the complexities of the religious laws and the fact, of course, that they unfortunately had no fundamental kinds of documents, like when Moses somehow unfortunately lost the original tablets, and when Joseph Smith unfortunately lost the golden tablets. They all seem to be rather absent-minded when it comes to trivial items of that sort. But the fact that there was no foundational and immediate evidence gave rise to the possibility that it required priests and Pharisees and scribes and so forth to endlessly argue all the fine details, all those dietary restrictions and so forth, and clothing restrictions, the sorts of things that the Islamic priesthood occupy themselves with now. I think that we probably do have the basis of our law comes from all those arguments, all those attempts to reconcile what some people thought was God's law with logic and reason, to the extent that it was possible to do so. And over time, it became apparent, I think, and I think that Ingersoll thought this too, that that there was a basic incompatibility between the basis of religious law and the basis of all other natural phenomenon and human philosophy and law as well. What do you think, Joe?
Well, That's a lot to cover in one thought. I wish I
Yes.
had been listening. No.
Sorry.
No, it's no problem. I'm not quite sure how to formulate my answer to that question, though. What do I think about Ingersoll's opinion on the conflict between religious law and civil law? Do I understand the question correctly?
Well, that would be one aspect of it, that religious law gave rise to all the other laws simply on the basis of it having a substantial history of argumentation.
Right. It had such a giant head start. I mean, if I understand the evolution from the troglodytes on, pretty much everything was ruled by superstition because they didn't know the answers to anything, and so and the idea, not only among Christianity, but many, if not all, most religions, is that if one of the members of the group performs some sort of offense to the deity is subject to punish the entire group. And therefore, the willingness to tolerate any sort of questioning or blasphemy was zero, and that was just a matter of self-defense. He cites the example, I think it's Achan, who, when they loot the city, he steals a few pieces of gold, and when Moses finds out about it, he has him and his entire family, wife, children, all hanged as a punishment for doing that. So there are no laws and punishments in the Bible other than death. As again, I quoted earlier, Ingersoll said it's the modern law that gives us fines instead of imprisonment, or imprisonment instead of death. So that was a major problem for Ingersoll. Also, again, his problem with persecution, inquisitions. Even today, we all know that as non-believers, we suffer persecution. We could lose our jobs or not get various jobs or customers, just as Ingersoll said. If people, I know from my own business that people won't do business with me because I was an atheist, and others would do business with me because I was, but neither here nor there. But the problem with the New Testament and the Bible is that it brings about persecution. Ingersoll says, the law gives a father the right to kill one who is about to do great bodily harm to his son. Now, if a father has the right to take the life of a man simply because he is attacking the body of his son, how much more would he have the right to take the life of one who is about to assassinate the soul of his son? And whatever they might do to him, this person who needed to be corrected, is only a very small taste of what the Almighty has in store for him with eternal punishment. So again, it makes for a very cruel God, and it makes for a very cruel society, and it makes for a very limited society, which is, if you don't look, think, and act like I do, your life expectancy could be fairly brief.
True enough.
That help?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Well, don't hesitate to ask some more questions. I am starting to wear a little on my throat, so I'll be happy to have other people talk for a while too. I do have another quote at hand, though. Ingersoll in Buffalo, New York, in 1878. Another example of his wit. He's talking about the banning of books, particularly Shakespeare, of which he was a great fan. It is very sad to think of the young men and women who have been eternally ruined by witnessing the plays of Shakespeare. And it is also sad to think of the young people, foolish enough to be happy, keeping time to the pulse of music, waltzing to hell in loving pairs, all for the glory of God and to the praise of his glorious justice. I think, too, of the thousands of men and women who, while listening to the music of Wagner, have absolutely forgotten the Presbyterian Creed. and who, for a little while, have been as happy as if the creed had never been written. Tear down the theaters, burn the opera houses, break all musical instruments, and let us go to church. That's the humor of Robert Ingersoll. And that brings us to the subject of Robert Ingersoll's creed. Here it is. Justice, this is the full creed, not the abbreviated version. Justice is the only worship. Love is the only priest, and ignorance is the only slavery. Happiness is the only good, and the time to be happy is now. The place to be happy is here, and the way to be happy is to make others so. And wisdom is the science of happiness. That's the creed of Robert Ingersoll. I always like to compare that to the Presbyterian Creed, to the first of the 4 points, the 5 points of Calvinism. The first point of Calvinism that is total depravity. You're born into total depravity. How does that make you feel compared to the time to be happy is now? So, and again, unlike Calvin, Robert Ingersoll never killed anybody, never had anybody sent to the rack or burned at the stake, which Calvin certainly did. So, so much for Calvin, and hooray for Robert Ingersoll. Any questions, comments?
It seems to me that from what I've read, he first started from Calvinism, not from religion altogether, but first from Calvinism as such.
That's
And
right,
then
he despised Calvin.
He
Correct.
despised Calvinism and then left religion altogether, but did differentiate, interestingly enough, between, I guess, Lutherist Protestantism and Calvinism. It is interesting to me because in Germany, basically all Protestants are Lutheran. Okay, and in Switzerland, where Calvin came from, they're more Calvinistic, and in Scotland as well. But most people in Europe will see Protestantism as associated with Luther, whereas here it's more associated with Calvin because it was more in that direction of the more austere way of looking at Protestantism.
Well, I think that's absolutely correct.
That he differentiated between the two.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're accurate. A good deal of difference between Calvinism and Lutheranism. Luther, they were contemporaries. Between the two of them, the only thing either one of them hated worse than sin was each other. And Luther, of course, was just as insane as Calvin ever was. There are accounts of him where he recommends that a woman take her son, whom he claims is actually the product of a liaison with the devil, and throw him into a canal. And he talks about what are called dicks, D-I-X. These are demons that live in the water, in the lakes, and the streams. Is why women almost never bathe, because you could become impregnated and produce some sort of apostate as a consequence of swimming. Sort of like, Mary needed an excuse. If you needed an excuse for that sudden bulge, you can always blame it on the demons that lived in the river, right? You certainly couldn't confess to how it really got there. Nevertheless, Martin Luther says that he actually met one of these children in Lyon, France. It was a 12-year-old boy, the product of a woman and a devil that lived in a lake. And the scary thing about the child, according to Luther, was that from the outside, he looked like a perfectly normal 12-year-old child. What other evidence do you need? So, pick your loony, Calvin or Luther. Benjamin Franklin, I think, gives us the summation that we need as to what these gentlemen and other theologians and theological scholars had to say, because they've written libraries full of books on the subject, which Benjamin Franklin reduced to the argument as "'tis so, 'tis not." That's the sum of all they had to say.
I have a question, Joe. Do you think that that he was aware of the Jefferson Bible?
Yes. He talks about how if you take all of the good parts out of the Bible, and there are some good parts, what's left is hollow. And if you take away the bullshit, the crap, what's left is morality. Or if you take away the morality from the Bible, that's what's left. So I'm quite sure that he must have had some knowledge of the Jefferson Bible to make those kinds of statements.
I wonder why that hasn't been promoted more. Most people have never heard of the Jefferson Bible.
Right.
It seems like that would have been a prime opportunity for something for him to promote as he traveled around the country.
I don't recall him ever recommending it or mentioning it. I just think it's hard for me to believe that a man of his knowledge on the subject would not have heard of it. Even people with very little religious historical knowledge have heard of the Jefferson Bible. You didn't have to explain to anyone here what it was. Anybody not know what the Jefferson Bible is? Who's willing to admit it?
I know what I've heard of the Jefferson Bible. I know that it was a highly edited version of the Bible in which he struck out everything that was nonsensical.
Right. Correct.
But I haven't seen any for sale.
No, I haven't either. I want to get off the subject of the Jefferson Bible for 1 second here.
Wait just a second. You can get it free online.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yes. The Jefferson Society, I think, distributes it.
Good. Okay. Thank you, Judy. I'd like to take a look at that myself just to see what it looks like. I had mentioned earlier that I had to quote Robert Ingersoll on the subject of alcohol. And so we've got a couple minutes here. It's about 2 paragraphs, but it's salient even today. And we have to remember that in the 1890s, there was a big movement for prohibition, which of course was finally enacted in 1920, I guess, the Volstead Act. In any case, here's Robert Ingersoll on the subject of alcohol. I am aware that there is a prejudice against any man engaged in the manufacture of alcohol. I believe that from the time it issues from the coiled and poisonous worm in the distillery until it empties into the hell of death, dishonor, and crime, that it demoralizes everybody that it touches. From its source to where it ends, I do not believe anybody can contemplate the subject without becoming prejudiced against the liquor crime. All we have to do, gentlemen, is to think of the wrecks on either side of the bank of the stream of death, of the suicides, of the insanity, of the poverty, of the ignorance, of the destitution, of the little children tugging at the faded and weary breasts and weeping and despairing wives, asking for bread, of the talented men of genius it has wrecked, the men struggling with imaginary serpents produced by this devilish thing. And when you think of the jails, the almshouses, the asylums, and of the prisons and the scaffolds upon either bank, I do not wonder that every thoughtful man is prejudiced against this stuff called alcohol. That's pretty clear. Any comments?
The church I grew up in was, if you ever had a sip of alcohol, you were going to hell regardless of what you did after that.
That's blasphemy, Judith, because the only unforgivable crime, unforgivable sin is to blaspheme the Holy Ghost. The Bible's clear on that. It doesn't say a word about not forgiving alcohol.
What did they serve in communion, Judy?
We had grape juice.
Grape juice, okay.
Brent, did you want to try? Brent said he tried to say something a while ago and nobody heard him. So I'm going to see if he wants to unmute and try
again.
Well, I just wanted to say that he probably couldn't get the rights to sell the Jefferson Bible. So, you know, that's probably a problem. But it's something else I just thought of when he was talking, and now I forgot it again. Oh, well. I guess we'll come back to it.
Okay. Just jump right in if you have a question or want to say something. Because I know you're a big fan of Ingersoll.
Yeah.
Is there anybody here that doesn't like Robert Ingersoll, even after what I just said about alcohol? No comments there. Well, good for you. All right.
Well, I suppose it should be it should be noted that when Ingersoll, toward the end of his career, was ranting about alcohol, that alcoholism was an extremely serious social problem. In fact, across the country, labor conditions were so bad, and that it drove a lot of workers into extremely stressful situations and states of mind. And the only relief they could find was the over imbibing in alcohol.
There was, yeah, go ahead.
So he was remarking upon what amounted to a national problem of a very severe nature at that time.
Particularly in the 1890s. He died in 1899. In the 1890s was a severe depression in the United States that rivaled or exceeded the depression of the 1920s. So the economic hardships were at least as severe as the Dust Bowl and the Okies and on and on and on. So alcohol would have been an even bigger problem, since a lot of people had nothing to eat to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I note.
Oh, go ahead, Joe. I mean, Jim. Young.
I want to say the reaction that was swept across America when they prohibited alcohol from being sold in Prohibition. It had a huge backlash, dwarfed only by the backlash of those who feel that their rights are being trampled on if they're asked to wear a mask to prevent infecting others with COVID-19. I just thought, that just came to me. There's not too many things that people are upset enough about to make a big deal of, but they sure have made a big deal out of alcohol and PPE. And I wish people could have heard Michelle Bearden on The Voice of Reason. I don't know whether y'all tuned in, but she really did a good job going down that path, talking about how people, they'll accept just about anything, but if you tell them that they need to put on a mask, that's it. You have crossed the line.
Wow. Yeah, you're taking away God's given breath. I know. You know, we've heard that Trump said, it's been said that Trump could walk down to Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and and his fans wouldn't care at all. Well, the word now is that among Democrats is that Joe Biden could walk down the street and shoot somebody, and they'd still vote for him.
Peter has his hand up. Peter, if you'd like to ask or comment.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments. I don't think anyone here has a negative opinion of Ingersoll, but I was reading from 65 press interviews with Robert Ingersoll, the only book I have about him. And the introduction is by Madeline O'Hare. And apparently, from reading this briefly, she was really not a big fan of Ingersoll, mostly for political reasons. I think they differed ideologically. She mentions that he was a ruthless attorney for the railroads. He opposed Abraham Lincoln until the actual war started. Essentially, she makes the argument that he got one issue right, but she disagreed with, this is kind of interesting, she disagreed with him on a bunch of other issues. Of course, he's looking back like a century. And she even mentioned, and this speaks to an earlier question, that in her view, and I don't know what evidence there is for this, but in her view, he left religion in large degree due to his wife's influence. Now, she doesn't say a lot about that, but I can read a sentence or two if you want to hear it.
Sure.
Okay. Sure. All right. Okay, most frequently his changes of mind and of heart came from the influence of those he loved. His turn from religion, for example, should be more honestly be seen as the result of his marriage to a woman who had abandoned it and who taught him that he should abandon any pretense of religion also. Now, I don't know what kind of historical evidence backs that claim, but it's just kind of interesting.
The criticism I heard of Ingersoll was that, first of all, he described himself as an agnostic. A lot of atheists, such as myself, think that's a bit of a cop-out. But the real criticism was that he was a very well-to-do, if not wealthy man, and that he had the assets to set up a charity or a society somewhat like Freedom from Religion Foundation or American Atheists or any sort of free thought group that could then lobby for church-state separation or for secular causes, just as we do today. And so he's criticized for not using any of his fortune in order to perpetuate an ongoing critique, and at least to keep religion honest, if that's the right word.
I think O'Hare makes that criticism also. Essentially, he did like the least he could have done. He could have done much more with some kind of endowment because he was so
Right, he had a huge
yeah.
influence, and he had the assets to do it, and he didn't.
Well, it sounds like his wife was a very good influence.
And she was rich.
Well, I think that mostly only rich people had the luxury of being able to think about these things and be contrary to society at that time, because the pressure on poor people was so strong. They really probably didn't have much time to think about most of this.
I want to make a comment on something that Karen put in the chat. Many people use the term, well, he was a staunch Republican, and they don't recognize that the Republican Party then was closer to the Democrats now,
right,
than it is as current Republicans. They basically did a big switch when, well, it started with FDR. When FDR proposed, that the Democrats essentially make a kinder, gentler America, and they did, and the Republicans hated that, and then of course it went through the Nixon era when he did the old Southern strategy to bring all the old Dixiecrats over, and so they basically have reversed places.
That's right. It's always been the solid South, but the color changed.
The yellow dog Democrats, they were called. If the Democrats nominated a yellow dog anywhere in the South, they would vote for a yellow dog. I like to bring that up because now I can point out that when Trump runs, I become what they call a Charles Manson Democrat.
Well, the Republicans have nominated an orange dog.
Well, you guys are a little tough on dogs there.
Well, and I'd like to go back to Madeleine Murray O'Hare's criticism of Ingersoll, which I think is valid, although I think she really stole his saying about the action of the hands being better than actions of prayers or something, because Ingersoll said that first, basically.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm sorry, but she was a crook. And if she's going to criticize anybody, she needs to be taken to task for what she did.
Yeah, Ingersoll's saying was the hands that help are better by far than the
lips that pray. Yeah, thank you, Brent, for that.
I think the other thing about Ingersoll is that I don't think he had so much of an interest in politics, although he was active in the Republican Party, and clearly he was in favor, like James Blaine. But I think his real interest was in bringing the truth about the Bible and about religion into the public eye, not so much changing their politics.
I think he enjoyed oration. I mean, it's like people who like joining debate clubs, you know, from what I've seen, his passion was in, yes, orating, speaking.
Right. Oh, yeah. You loved it.
And
And
I
writing.
mean, as you said, there's so many books of it. And I also read that he learned them by heart. He orated freely for up to 3 hours without, you know, reading notes or something. So I think the pleasure and the pleasure he derived, yes, in his criticism of the Bible of religion, but it was, I understood also that it was a celebration of naturalism, of logic, of other basic virtues that didn't have to be defined by a deity, so to say. In other words, sort of the approach of go out into the world and look around. You know, you don't need somebody to explain to you hellfire or what, you know. He took a more, I don't know, Darwinistic approach, maybe you might want to call it, but that's maybe a bit misleading.
I read that he filled the Coliseum in Chicago, or whatever the meeting hall was, and that there were several thousand people who came to see him and who stood in line for several hours in order to pay $2 for the privilege of hearing him speak and debate. Now, in the 19th century, $2 is a week's pay.
Actually, he had a very interesting approach to Darwinism. He told this story. He says, you know, when I first heard about this Darwin thing, I was appalled. I mean, think of the people that had nothing to brag about in their lives except their ancestry. I mean, the king and the queen and people that all they'd ever done in their life was based on their ancestry. And now their ancestry can be traced backward much farther. And there would be king orangutan and chimpanzee prince, etc. He said, you know, after thinking about it a bit, I like that thing.
Yeah, but the lizards that came before me, you had to see these lizards. I mean,
The thing about Darwinism is that the less people know about it, the more they were critical. And 1 minute they were criticizing Darwin, and the next minute they were floundering around on the floor talking in tongues. So much for them. Well, we pretty well.
I got a comment. I sit here watching a lot of videos every day, and naturally I'm gravitated to debates between Christians and atheists. I saw one the other day between a Christian, supposedly science teacher, and it was a debate with Aaron Raw, if you guys are familiar. And this was a horrible debate. It started out pretty good, but this science teacher was going on and on about how much he loved science. And in the course of arguing with Aaron Raw, he brought up irreducible complexity, which is nothing more than a pseudoscientific creationist argument, which has been refuted, debunked completely. If you remember the Dover, Pennsylvania's court case in which Michael Bay, he tried to defend intelligent design creationism and pretend that it was a valid scientific hypothesis. But anyway, Aaron Ra got extremely upset because of the fact that this guy was pushing irreducible complexity. And when Aaron Ra corrected him, the man was just completely intransigent. He continued to try to push this irreducible complexity as real science. So finally, the conversation broke down into a shouting match, and Aaron Ra got fed up and he just said, "The hell with this, I'm out of here." So he left. Now, of course, the people who had posted these videos, they claimed that the Christian apologist had won the debate. And I posted a little message on below the video, and I said, well, I watched the whole thing, and I have to say that the question of who won the debate depends upon what you call a win. If you call a win sticking to science, then Aaron Ra won. But if you call a win turning the conversation into a chaotic shouting match because of insisting on pseudoscience to be science, then if that's your game, I guess you can claim that the creationist won because he drove off Aaron Ra in frustration. So anyway, I posted that, and the person who had that channel got very, very upset. I was very surprised that he came back and posted to me, calling me every book. I mean to tell you, he just went all up and down over the fact that I had dared question the integrity of this science teacher, because I made, pardon?
An ad hominem.
I made an ad hominem because I stated that any science teacher who deliberately dumbed down children with pseudoscience in a science classroom was not worthy of admiration or respect. That was almost verbatim the statement that I made, and that just blew them away. But anyway, as you were going on about Ingersoll, it brought that to my mind about how intransigent the religious community is to accepting science, facts, and reality. So the illusion that Ingersoll had that religion would die, he was delusional about that. And so a lot of people, I hear a lot of atheists today still arguing that the days of religion are numbered, but I cannot see how in the world that they can come to that conclusion.
I don't think their days are numbered. I said earlier, we'll never get rid of religion, but the time is coming when their influence on the government and the laws and day-to-day activities of their fellow men will be significantly reduced. It already is dwindling. We see that in the fact that people do all sorts of things that they never would have done even a few years ago. Dancing, bowling. At one time, a woman who went in a bowling alley only went there for one reason, because she was a prostitute. Okay, women in bars, never heard of such a thing. Again, I mentioned dancing, and the list gets long. Drinking on Sundays or buying alcohol, music in your church, or music of any description for that matter. So it's a battle that we're winning, but we'll never get rid of fundamentalists, just like we'll never get rid of Trumpsters and we'll never get rid of herpes. It's that simple.
I disagree. I don't think that it's going. I think that the usage of religion by politicians to garner voters or to push their political direction, whether it be in the high courts or with abortion or whatever it is, you know, on top of it all, they're all a bunch of sorry, not all, but many of them are such hypocrites about it. You know, let's quote the fact that, is that your Bible? No, it's a Bible, because I'm surprised he didn't even hold it upside down, you know, because seeing how his press secretary recently had to tell people that, yes, the president can read. But anyway, I'm surprised how strongly it remains in certain parts, how it's used to not even explain, but to reinforce beliefs that are, you know, racist or intolerant or whatever. And the separation of state and religion has, in my opinion, become even stronger now than it was maybe 15 years ago. But that's my personal opinion to it. I find it that it's gained an importance to say, whether you're religious or not. You were saying, you know, because you said you were an atheist rather than an agnostic, that people, you know, disapproved of that or whatever. And it's resembling more and more the way it is all over the world, even among Muslims, that you'll be asked first, are you a Sunni or a Sunnite, to recognize whether you are on the right side. You know, are you a Catholic, or are you a Protestant, are you a Baptist or a Methodist, you know? And
I think a lot of people,
you could be agnostic or atheist, you know?
I think a lot of people are moving away from organized religion, but they're taking the position that they have a special relationship with God, which in my mind, of course, is the height of conceit. We have a universe that takes 13.9 billion years at the speed of light to traverse, and out of that, somebody has taken a personal interest in you. Yeah, right. Nevertheless, we have spiritualists. You know, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. And, you know, people don't want to give up that. They're hedging their bets. It's sort of like Pascal's wager. You know what I mean? I don't want to forego it completely, not only because I'm worried about the afterlife, but because I've got friends and family who will shun me, and people at work, and I don't want to lose status or caste or my job, and so on and so on. So,
Peter has his hand raised for a question.
Yes, I just wanted to add a demographic consideration. As most of you probably know, the most secular group age-wise would be people, under 40. They increasingly identify as nuns, right? N-O-N-E-S.
Right. Kind of not.
I don't think religion is going away. It's not going to become extinct. But I do think if you look at the demographics, the popular support, which undergirds state legislatures, judicial selections, presidents, is likely to move in a more secular direction in the next couple of decades. I think there's cause for hope.
No, I agree. Again, I point out that religion is $1 trillion bankroll. And if you think they're going to give that up without a fight, right. They're already lining up to blame non-believers and blasphemers for the coronavirus, for the depression, for the lack of fresh air, for the poor quality of programming on television, whatever.
Well, the fear I have is because right now Mitch McConnell and his ilk are getting so many judges into the district courts, not just the Supreme Court, but the district courts, that the effort to maintain a secular government is going to be set back quite a bit. And even though the populace may be moving away from it, the people in power are pushing it even harder because they know they're about to lose out. I think you said, I can't remember now, sorry, that they're not going, you said it, Joe, that they're not easily going to give up that money pit, that money bag. But we're going to have a hard effort in the near future until some of these judges are disbarred for incompetence to keep our government secular. Our state legislature is a prime example of the move to introduce religion back into the public schools.
Religion has always been about power and control.
Yes, absolutely. But they're codifying it right now quite a bit.
Yeah, they're increasing their efforts, and they're becoming more successful at being able to belly right up to the public trough.
Yes, they are.
Which is what they do for a living. All religions are mendicants. All religions are beggars. They don't produce anything. I'm quoting Robert Ingersoll. They don't make any grain, or they raise any crops or produce any products whatsoever. They are for a living. They are beggars, and they speak very highly of charity, which is understandable since people that live off of charity would be in favor of it.
May I make a comment? I noted in the news a couple of things that have recently taken place. One being that the Supreme Court just issued a decision which took a huge, took an axe to the separation of the wall of separation.
Montana case.
Yeah. And I also noted that there was a governor of one of the states who signed into law legislation, this is a red state, in which 1 hour of each school day, students are allowed to take time out of class for religious activities. Not only does this damage, I think they said it adds up to, if you add up all of those 1 hours over the course of a school year, it would be like 22 school days that the education system has reduced the school's teaching.
Reminds me of that math problem. You know, the one about the snail who's going up the inside of the well during the daytime, and then every night he slides back down.
Sisyphus?
No. It's a snail. Snail is crawling up the wall, and it's going up the wall of the well, and then every night he slides back down. So it's like, how long does it take for him to get out of the well if he goes up 3 inches every daytime and slides back down 2?
How big is the well?
Well, that's given in the problem. But the thing is, that's what we're facing here. We're facing, well, the government goes forward in the daytime, but then in the dark of the night,
they're back.
Yeah, the Bible slides back. They do it behind closed scenes. They pressure, politicians not to do things. They get judges elected who pretend they're not religious, but they actually are. It's an ever-ending battle.
Tony has her hand up, and then Jim Peterson. Sorry.
I just want to remind us about what we heard. I believe it was last Sunday about the power of the worshipers and the Christian nationalists that they are promoting. Some politicians that they want to take power. So religion is not going anywhere. And the Watchmen on the Wall, the Family Research Council, they are all promoting religion and conservatives in power. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Before you, Peterson, before you ask your question, Rick O'Keefe asked in the chat, and Brent answered it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What did Ingersoll say about religion in American government? Because I know you have a great quote about that one. Go.
Well, I think I read the quote about religion and government and how, I'd have to go back and find it here.
Oh, sorry.
But no, to the effect that, to the extent that religion interferes with the government, it actually reverses or retards what government is supposed to be doing. Let me find the quote. Go ahead.
Okay, Jim Peterson, you want to do it? You ask your question, I mean.
Yes. I'm responding to Brent's comment about the snail going up 2 inches or going up 3 inches and sliding back 2, and the difficulty of overcoming the trajectory that religion has gotten us started on. And that is, whereas in previous ages, progress, generally speaking, was so slow that it didn't really matter all that much. Life was pretty much the same from one epoch to another. But now things are considerably accelerated, and which presents us with a grave difficulty, because our power has been so amplified, first by the atomic bomb, by the presence of electricity, by the electronic and computer age in which we live, that the crises that are upon us, and we're suffering right now through at least 4 of them, are such that there's some debate about whether or not we'll actually survive as a species, because our culture cannot keep up with the changes that we have made, and we want to persist in doing things in the old way rather than adjusting our culture to the mandates of a new way of life founded upon the science that we have developed. So I wanted to see if there was a general concurrence with that opinion. Don't everybody jump up at once now.
No one seriously disagrees, apparently.
Well, repeat the question, please.
Oh, no. Well, basically it boils down to the question of whether or not our generation of human beings can overcome the power of religion to retard our progress in time for us to overcome the grave problems we have created for ourselves.
Okay, so that's never going to happen. We're not going to overcome religion in time. I don't agree with Joe that religion is on the wane. I think it's getting stronger because of the institutionalizing it in the infrastructure of the nation. Just like the Supreme Court decision, the Betty Voss actions, this governor dedicating an hour a day to students to engage in religion. And if each one of these little bites, if you will, out of secularism has a weighted effect overall, it makes it almost impossible to overcome the influence of religion in society. So the key is the children, and we are dumbing down the children. We are brainwashing them, and now we're doing it in public schools. So the children have no escape. And if the children are brainwashed in public schools, that settles the issue. This country can never, the country can never recover, in my opinion.
I would point out that many of us here were raised in religion, and yet we found our way out. But I agree with you, Jim Young, that is, they are systematically dismantling public education and moving things over to religious schools. Betsy DeVos is an example, but here in Florida, they are now quadrupling the money that is being taken from public schools and being given to private schools, which are predominantly religious. And as Karen points out in the chat, that most mental health services now are provided by churches, AA, and those kinds of things, and the insurances are not covering them if you have insurance. So there are many moves to maintain this religious view, but I do have a little bit of optimism in that most of us came up through religion and left it. So, it's not enough. We need to be much more secular than we are in our government, and we need to work for that. But I don't think it's all doom and gloom. But it is difficult.
I tend not to be an optimist. I agree. But when you have the cards stacked so heavily against progress, I think that
but it was that way for hundreds of years, Jim. I mean, up until the 50s.
But I want to ask you this, Judy. What has the secular community got going for it to overcome all of these policy decisions and infrastructure decisions that are being put into place? What have we got? What tools do we have? We can't even access these children to reason with them. And the people, the quantity that are capable of escaping are few. They're not by any means in the majority. I will say that there is one optimistic thing, the internet.
Yes.
Okay.
That's one thing.
This is one thing that we do have that they have not yet figured out how to silence the secular community, but it could be coming down the pike. There has been legislation proposed in the Congress of the United States by Republicans in the past to make it a crime to criticize a deity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, it did not pass, but that doesn't mean that it won't eventually come back and pass. They have such a law, as I understand it, in the United Kingdom, a blasphemy law.
They do. You have to remember that we're up against, even if their numbers are very small, which they're not, but even if they became small, we're still up against a group of dedicated fanatics with an unlimited bankroll. Yes. Doesn't take very many of them to swing the pendulum in their direction. Ours is a war of attrition. If we see any benefits during our lifetime, that may be as far as we're going to get until the next lot has a shot at it. I don't think we'll see less religion, and the less religion we see, the more intransigent will be the remainder, the base, if you want to call them that. The more fanatical, the more fundamentalist, and the more they're going to dig in their heels.
And if you think we have a chance to influence public policy, just try to run for a public office as an atheist.
No, you're right. The secret is the children, and they know that better than we do.
Yeah. Jim Peterson wants to say something badly.
Badly, I want to say it in the worst way. I will. No, I think we can be greatly heartened by the experience of Ireland. Never was a country, as a country, more religion bound than Ireland. I mean, it was a pathetic place throughout the much of the 20th century. However, in the present time, Ireland is a determinedly secular country. They have undone all those priestly claws which have sunken into their society. They've overthrown their divorce laws. They've made abortion legal. They have undone the blasphemy law. I mean, it's extraordinary how far they have come, and for such a long history of oppression by the Catholic Church. So when they can do that, I feel that it is possible for a secular society within our own country and with the world at large to actually overcome all this religious claptrap for what it is. And largely because of, as Jim put it, the internet is a major source of hope, that we can communicate with each other, we can expose some of the crap that's going on, and we can try to organize our lives and our societies in ways which are more progressive than we are now.
Karen has a comment or question, and Rick has another question in the comments in the chat room, and then it's going to be time to wrap it up. So Joe, I don't know if you have a closing statement you want to make.
I do not have a closing statement per se,
Okay.
but we'll come up with something.
Okay, so Karen, you want to go ahead?
Yes, maybe one last comment to what was just being discussed as far as secularism goes. I think part of the problem is also the economic divide, that the less fortunate people are more highly organized in religion, which for them for years has been a traditional source of riposte and hopefulness and yes, you know, make them feel good, make them feel hopeful, a place to go to bring their pain and their sorrow and to receive that. Not that I believe in that, but that's the way it is. And for many people, it is their sole consolation in struggling with the day-to-day things that are going on, especially now. But it's also because, as far as Ireland goes, there was a wish to unite, Jim. We haven't reached that point. There isn't a wish to unite right now across this country. There's a wish to divide. And there's no room for discourse as there was, as we're talking about, or the type of things that Ingersoll wrote about. It's either them or us or red or blue. You know, the exchange of ideas, the exchange of thoughts, the openness that was once a tradition isn't there anymore. And of course, in that case, religion is going to be on the rise because they're going to say they have God on their side, you know, and all of us as non-believers, we're just the devil, you know. So I think that you can do anything or move in a secular direction, as many countries have, or as even countries like Turkey had, which was unbelievable, you know, at the time when Atatürk came into power in the 1920s. He secularized Turkey, and people wish it would go back to that way it was. They hate that Erdogan is taking it in a religious direction. So the question is always, in my eyes, economics and a wish for unity and not a wish for division. That would be my comment on that.
So thank you, Karen. Rick's question was concerning spiritualists and what did Ingersoll have to say about the spiritualist movement started in the 1820s?
I'm afraid I cannot answer that question.
Okay, good answer. And then if I can get back to it, Faith had a comment about having at least one openly non-believer in Congress right now, and that is some progress that we can have at least one person who is open about their non-belief. We have several in Florida that are openly non-believers, especially in the Orlando and Tampa area for some bizarre reason. But that's very good. And And yes, Peter is commenting that there are fits and bursts back and forth. Yes, we have that pendulum that swings left and right, but it is it's going so far right now. It's kind of hard to imagine it coming back too much of a left lean, but I hope it does.
And you can see the conservatives, not just Fox News, but they own all of the radio stations.
Yes.
Our conservatives. When we go down to do the voice of reason, we're the only voice of reason on the entire radio channel. Everybody else.
And they're taking over control of most newspapers. Not that that is all that important anymore, since most of them don't print much. But anyway.
And the Sinclair Group has taken over all the TV stations.
Yes. So it's.
And I might mention that YouTube has taken to defunding or demonetizing a lot of the channels that are free thought, atheist, or independent news. It seems like there is a concerted effort to limit the voices, even if they don't outright ban the voices of the left. So every time I tune into one of these channels, they're begging for supporters to make donations because YouTube has demonetized their videos.
Yeah, you have to have like 10,000 followers now on YouTube to be able to monetize your channel, which we don't come anywhere close to that, but anyway.
Just to give you an example of how long these kinds of struggles go on, you know, the women's suffrage movement started right after the Civil War, and it was the mid-20s before they got the right to vote. In 1883, Robert Ingersoll was a very strong supporter of the federal civil rights bill. It lost.
Yes, of course. But anyway, so let's go ahead and have you wrap it up, and we'll.
Well, can I say one more thing?
Can I stop you, Jim?
Yes.
How can I stop you, right?
Go ahead.
Okay, I really would like to hear something from Ed Golly. Ed Golly's always got something good to share with people, and he comes to these meetings and he sits there like a potato. He doesn't say anything. Come on, Ed, speak up and say something.
You're interrupting his nap.
Apparently.
Well, that's up to him, Jim. If he wants to say something, he's welcome to, but can't force people to talk.
It's to you, Joe.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for coming. I hope you found it at least a little bit interesting and informative. I'm looking forward to next week when we'll be talking about critical thinking and the rules of logic and how to make A look like B.
Yes.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Joe. Excellent talk.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
If anyone is, if anyone's interested in getting a discount or free shipping on a T-shirt with an Ingersoll quotes,
I bought one.
Yay! Thank you. I will send you the link, and the free shipping will last until Friday. So please let me know if you're interested.
And don't forget, you can get everything Robert Ingersoll ever wrote is available online. You can download it, you can cut and paste it, or you can buy the collected works or any of his flagship pieces very inexpensively.
Thank you all very much. Nice talk.
Thank you, Joe.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye.
Great to see
you
everyone.
next week. Thank you.